Among the towns of Jutland, Viborg justly holds a high place. It's the seat of a bishopric. It has a handsome but almost entirely new cathedral, a charming garden, a lake of great beauty, and many storks, but I am not writing a guidebook. There are good hotels in Viborg, Preisler's and a Phoenix, but my cousin, whose experiences I have to tell you now, went to the Golden Lion the first time that he visited Viborg. The Golden Lion is one of the very few houses in the town that was not destroyed in the Great Fire of 1726. The sun was setting when my cousin walked up to the door, and the light slanted onto the imposing facade of the house. He was delighted with the old-fashioned aspect of the place and promised himself a thoroughly satisfactory and amusing stay in an inn so typical of old Jutland. It was not business in the ordinary sense of the word that brought my cousin, Mr. Anderson, to Viborg. He was engaged upon some researches into the church history of Denmark and promised to spend as much as 3 weeks examining and copying rare papers. These papers were saved from the Great Fire and charted the last days of Roman Catholicism in the country. He hoped that the Golden Lion would be able to give him a room of sufficient size to serve him as a bedroom and a study. On the first floor, there was a choice of 2 or 3 rooms, which would, so far as size went, suit admirably. Eventually, number 12 was selected. Like its neighbors, it had 3 windows, all on one side of the room. It was fairly high and unusually long. Supper time was approaching, and when Anderson had washed and tidied, he went downstairs. There were still a few minutes before the bell rang. He spent them examining the list of his fellow lodgers. The list was not exciting. The one and only point which suggested any food for thought was the absence of any number 13 from the tail of the rooms. Following supper, my cousin's evening was spent in unpacking and arranging his clothes, books, and papers. Towards 11 o'clock, he decided to go to bed. But with him, an almost necessary preliminary to sleep was the reading of a few pages of print, and he now remembered that the particular book which he'd been reading in the train, and the one that he now wanted, which alone would satisfy him at that present moment, was in the pocket of his greatcoat, hanging on a peg outside the dining room. To run down and find it would only take a moment, and as the passages were by no means dark, it was not difficult for him to find his way back to his own door. So at least he thought. But when he arrived there and turned the handle, the door entirely refused to open, and he caught the sound of a hasty movement towards it from within. Tried the wrong door, of course. Was his own room to the right or to the left? He glanced at the number. It was 13. His room would be on the left, and so it was. It was only after he'd been in bed for some minutes, had read the usual 3 pages or 4 pages of his book, blown out his light and turned over to go to sleep, only then did it occur to him that whereas on the blackboard at the hotel there'd been no number 13, there was undoubtedly a room numbered 13 in the hotel. But probably it was used as a servant's room or something of the kind. After all, it was most likely not so large or good a room as his own, and he looked drowsily about the room in the half-light from the street lamp. It was a curious effect, he thought. Rooms usually look larger in a dim light than a full one, but this seemed to have contracted in length and grown proportionately higher. Well, sleep was more important than these vague ruminations, and to sleep he went. The next day, Anderson attacked the Riksarkiv, the archives of Viborg. The documents laid before him were far more numerous and interesting than he had anticipated. Besides official papers, there was a large bundle of correspondence relating to Joran Fries, the last Roman Catholic bishop. In these letters were intimate details of his private life. There was much talk of a house in the town that the bishop owned, but did not live in. Its tenant, Master Nicholas Franken, had an infamous reputation, it seemed. The reforming party put it about the city that the tenant of the bishop's house was a disgrace, his life a scandal. He practiced secret and wicked arts and had sold his soul to the enemy, to Beelzebub, to Satan. It was an outrage that such a creature, this blood-sucker, should be harbored by the bishop. The bishop met these reproaches boldly. He protested his own abhorrence of all such things as secret arts, and required his antagonist to bring the matter before the proper court. No one could be more ready and willing than himself to condemn Nicholas Franken if the evidence showed him to have been guilty of any of the crimes informally alleged against him. On leaving the office, Mr. Anderson was accompanied by the old gentleman who presided over it, and as they walked, the conversation, very naturally, turned to the papers of which I've just been speaking. "This house of the Bishop Fries," the archivist said, "it is a great puzzle to me where it can have stood. I have studied carefully the topography of Old Viborg, but it is most unlucky. A complete inventory of the bishop's property was made in 1650, which we have in the archive, but the section that listed where the town property was, that has been destroyed." After taking some exercise, I forget exactly how or where, Anderson went back to the Golden Lion, his supper, his game of patience, and his bed. On the way to his room, it occurred to him that he had forgotten to talk to the landlord about the omission of number 13 from the hotel, and also that he might as well make sure that number 13 did actually exist before he made any reference to the matter. The decision wasn't difficult to arrive at. There was the door, with its number as plain as could be. And work of some kind was evidently going on inside it, for as he neared the door, he could hear footsteps and voices, or a voice within. In the next few seconds, while he was making sure of the number of the room, the footsteps stopped, seemingly very near the door, and he was a little startled to hear hissing, quick breaths, like someone in a state of high excitement. He went on to his own room and was surprised to find how cramped it seemed. In the meantime, he wanted something. As far as I remember, it was a pocket handkerchief out of his portmanteau, which had been placed by the porter on a very inadequate trestle or stool against the wall at the farthest end of the room from his bed. Here was a very curious thing. The portmanteau was not to be seen. Oh, it must have been moved by officious servants. Doubtless the contents had been put in the wardrobe. No, there was nothing there. This was maddening. He went to the right-hand window and looked out on the quiet street. It was a dark night. No passers-by. There was a tall building opposite, with large spaces of dead wall. The light was behind him, and you could see his own shadow clearly cast on the wall. Also the shadow of the bearded man in number 11 on the left, who passed to and fro in his shirt sleeves once or twice, and was seen first brushing his hair and later on in a nightgown. Also the shadow of the occupant of number 13 on the right. Number 13 was like himself, leaning his elbows on the windowsill, looking out into the street. He seemed to be a tall, thin man. Or was it by any chance a woman? At least it was someone who covered his or her head with some kind of drapery before going to bed. And Anderson thought he must have a red lampshade in the room. And the lamp must be flickering very much. Now came a distant step in the street, and its approach seemed to recall number 13 to a sense of his exposed position, for very swiftly and suddenly the figure, swept aside from the window, and the red light went out. Next morning he was woken by the chambermaid with hot water, etc. He roused himself, and after thinking out the correct Danish words, said as distinctly as he could, "You must not move my portmanteau." "Where is it?" As is not uncommon, the maid laughed and went away without making any distinct answer. Anderson, rather irritated, sat up in bed intending to call her back. But he remained sitting up, staring straight in front of him. There was his portmanteau, on its trestle, exactly where he'd seen the porter put it when he first arrived. This was a rude shock for a man who prided himself on his accuracy of observation. How could it possibly have escaped him the night before? He couldn't think. At any rate, there it was now. The daylight showed more than the portmanteau. It let the proportions of the room with its 3 windows appear, and Anderson was satisfied that his choice had, after all, not been a bad one. He started to go down to breakfast. Rather late, but number 13 was later. Here were his boots, still outside his door. A gentleman's boots. So then number 13 was a man, not a woman. Just then he caught sight of the number on the door. It was 14. He thought he must have passed number 13 without noticing it. 3 stupid mistakes in 12 hours were too much for a methodical, accurate-minded man, so he turned back to make sure. The next number to 14 was number 12, his own room. There was no number 13 at all. During the day, he continued his examination of the episcopal correspondence. To his disappointment, it was incomplete. Only one other letter could be found, which referred to the affair of Master Nicholas Franken. It was from the Catholic bishop Jürgen Fries to the Protestant leader Rasmus Nielsen. He said, "Although we are not in the least degree inclined to agree to your judgment concerning our court, and shall be prepared, if need be, to withstand you to the uttermost in that behalf, since our trusty and well-loved Master Nicholas Franken, against whom you have dared to allege certain false and malicious charges, has been suddenly removed from among us, it is apparent that for the moment the question must be put aside." Search as he might, Anderson could find no sequel to this letter, nor any clue to the whereabouts of the said Nicholas Franken. He could only suppose that he had died suddenly, as there were only 2 days between the date of Nielsen's last letter, when Franken was evidently still alive, and that of the bishop's letter. Death must have been completely unexpected. At supper, my cousin found himself next to the landlord. "When you came here, Was there a number 13? No. No, there was not. Then what did you use your number 13 for? Asked Anderson. My number 13. Why, don't I tell you there isn't such a thing in the house? I thought you might have noticed that. If there was, it would be next door to your own room. Anderson was in some ways relieved by his certainty, but still puzzled, and he began to think that the best way to make sure whether he had indeed been subject to an illusion or not was to invite the landlord to his room to smoke a cigar later on in the evening. Herr Christensen was flattered by the invitation and very willingly accepted it. At about 10 o'clock he was to make his appearance, but before that Anderson had some letters to write, and he went upstairs to do so. Truth to tell, an embarrassing truth too, he was becoming quite nervous about the question of the existence of number 13, so much so that he approached his room by way of number 11, in order that he might not have to pass the door, or the place where the door ought to be. He looked quickly and suspiciously about the room when he entered it, but there was nothing beyond the indefinable air of being smaller than usual. Nothing to justify any misgivings. Anderson wrote his letters, ordered in whiskey and soda, and then when he'd finished he went to the window and studied the dead wall opposite and the shadows upon it. As far as he could remember, number 14 had been occupied by the lawyer, a staid man who said little at meals, being generally engaged in studying a small bundle of papers beside his plate. Apparently, however, he was in the habit of giving vent to his animal spirits when alone. Why else should he be dancing? The shadow from the next room evidently showed that he was. Again and again, his thin form crossed the window, his arms waved, and a gaunt leg was kicked up with surprising agility. He seemed to be barefooted, and the floor must be well laid. No sound gave away his movements. The landlord at this moment knocked at Anderson's door. To judge from his look of surprise when he found himself in the room, Herr Christensen was struck, as Anderson had been, by something unusual in its aspect. But at that moment the lawyer began to sing, and to sing in a manner which could leave no doubt in anyone's mind that he was either exceedingly drunk or raving mad. It was a high, thin voice that they heard, and it seemed dry, as if from long disuse. Singing a song, you could call it. It went sailing up to a surprising height and was carried down with a despairing moan, like a winter wind in a hollow chimney or an organ when the bellows suddenly fail. It was a really horrible sound. And Anderson felt that if he'd been alone, he must have fled for refuge and company to some neighbor bagman's room. Just then there was an impatient knock at the door. It was the lawyer. In a state of undress, and very tousled and very angry he looked. "I beg pardon, sir," he said, "but I should be much obliged if you would kindly desist." Here he stopped. It was evident that neither of the persons before him was responsible for the disturbance, and after a moment's lull, it swelled forth again more wildly than before. "But what in the name of heaven does it mean?" The lawyer cried out. "Where is it? Who is it? Am I going out of my mind?" "Oh, surely, Herr Jensen," Anderson said. "It comes from your room next door. Isn't there a cat or something stuck in the chimney?" Impossible, said the lawyer. Impossible. There is no chimney. I came here because I was convinced the noise was going on here. It was certainly in the room next to mine. Was there no door between yours and this one? Said Anderson eagerly. No, sir, said Herr Jensen rather sharply. At least not this morning. Ah, said Anderson. Nor tonight? I am not sure, said the lawyer with some hesitation. Suddenly the crying or singing voice in the next room died away, and the singer was heard, it seemed, laughing to himself in a soft, crooning sort of way. The three men actually shivered at the sound. Then there was a silence. But we must do something, said Anderson. The three of us. Shall we go and investigate in the next room? There was a deadly quiet outside in the passage, but a light shone from under the next door. Anderson and Jensen approached it. Jensen turned the handle and gave a sudden, vigorous push. No use. The door stood fast. Herr Christensen, said Jensen, will you go and fetch the strongest servant you have in the place? We must see this through. The landlord nodded and hurried off, glad to be away from the scene of action. Jensen's back was now to the door. In that moment the door opened and an arm came out and clawed at his shoulder. It was clad in ragged, yellowish linen, and the bare skin where it could be seen had long grey hair upon it. Anderson was just in time to pull Jensen out of its reach with a cry of disgust. And then the door shut, and a low laugh was heard. Jensen had seen nothing, but when Anderson hurriedly told him what a risk he had run, he fell into a great state of agitation and suggested that they should give up the enterprise and lock themselves in one or other of their rooms. However, while he was developing this plan, the landlord and two able-bodied men arrived on the scene. The younger stepped forward, raised his crowbar, and dealt a tremendous blow on the upper panel. The result was not in the least what any of them anticipated. There was no rending or cracking of wood, only a dull sound, as if the solid wall had been struck. The man dropped his tool with a shout and began rubbing his elbow. His cry drew their eyes to him for a moment. Then Anderson looked at the door again. It was gone. The plaster wall of the passage stared him in the face, with a deep gash in it where the crowbar had struck it. Number 13 had passed out of existence. An early cock crowed in the yard, and as Anderson glanced in the direction of the sound, he saw through the window at the end of the long passage that the eastern sky was paling to the dawn. Next morning, the same party reassembled in number 12. The furniture was cleared away, and at the cost of a good many irretrievably damaged planks. That portion of the floor was taken up which lay nearest to number 14. Now you will naturally suppose that a skeleton, say that of Master Nicholas Franken, was discovered. That was not so. What they did find, lying between the beams which supported the flooring, was a small copper box. In it was a neatly folded vellum document with about 20 lines of writing. I had the whole story from my cousin a few months later when we were on a sea voyage together. You have to tell me about the document, I said. The document in the copper box. What can I tell you? Well, what happened, I said. He told me what he knew. Both Anderson and Jensen, who proved to be something of a paleographer, were much excited by the discovery which promised to afford the key to these extraordinary phenomena. My cousin and the lawyer examined the document for 2 whole days, but which way up was the writing meant to be read? What language was it in? Jensen, the bolder spirit of the two, hazarded the conjecture that it must be either Latin or Old Danish. Anderson offered no theories and was very willing to surrender the box and the parchment to the Historical Society of Viborg to be placed in their museum. And to this day, consult all the learned experts you will, no one has understood or even deciphered a single line of this enigma.